America. Genesis Episode 3. Central Theological Themes of Genesis. The Book of Genesis, known as Bereshit, in the beginning, in Hebrew, serves as the foundational text of the Jewish Torah and Tanakh, not only through its narrative structure but also through its profound theological themes. These themes, God as sovereign creator, the covenant relationship, humanity's dignity and fall, and family and divine legacy, form the theological backbone of Genesis, providing a framework for understanding God's nature, humanity's purpose, and Israel's unique role in divine history. Each theme is intricately woven into the text, shaping the theological worldview of the Torah and influencing Jewish identity, practice, and thought. This exploration examines each theme in depth, tracing its development across Genesis's narratives, its significance in Jewish tradition, and its broader impact on religious and ethical discourse. 1. God as sovereign creator. The theme of God as sovereign creator is the theological cornerstone of Genesis, establishing the nature of God as the all-powerful, purposeful, and good creator of the universe. This theme, introduced in the opening verse, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," Genesis 1:1, underpins the entire book and sets the stage for the Torah's narrative of divine authority and human responsibility. The creation narrative, Genesis 1:2. Genesis 1:1-2:3. This poetic account describes God creating the world in 6 days, transforming chaos, tohu vavahu, Genesis 1:2, into an ordered cosmos. Each day introduces a new aspect of creation: light, sky, land, celestial bodies, animals, and humans, culminating in the Sabbath rest on the 7th day. The repetitive phrase "and God saw that it was good," for example, Genesis 1:10, affirms the inherent goodness of creation, while the final declaration that it was very good, Genesis 1:31, underscores its perfection. Genesis 2:4-25, a complementary account, focuses on the creation of humanity, with God forming Adam from the dust, Adamah, a wordplay with Adam, meaning human, and breathing life into him. Eve is created from Adam's rib, emphasizing their unity and partnership. This narrative highlights God's intimate involvement with humans, placing them in the Garden of Eden with responsibilities to cultivate and guard it. Theological implications. These accounts establish God as sovereign, creating through divine speech, and God said, in contrast to ancient Near Eastern myths like the Babylonian Enuma Elish, where creation results from divine conflict. Genesis's monotheistic vision portrays God as transcendent, intentional, and relational, setting the theological tone for the Torah. Sovereignty and order. The structured creation process reflects God's sovereignty, bringing order to formlessness. The separation of light from darkness, waters from land, and the establishment of time, day and night, demonstrate God's authority over chaos, a recurring theme in the Torah, for example, the parting of the Red Sea in Exodus. The Sabbath, instituted as God's rest, Genesis 2:2-3, sanctifies time, becoming a central Jewish practice. The Kiddush prayer on Shabbat references Genesis, linking creation to worship and reinforcing God's sovereignty over time and creation. Goodness of creation. The repeated affirmation of creation's goodness counters pessimistic or dualistic world views, affirming the world's value and purpose. This theology influences Jewish practices like Barakot, blessings over food, nature, etc., which express gratitude for creation. Rabbinic tradition, such as Bereshit Rabbah, interprets the goodness of creation as evidence of God's love, suggesting that the world was created for humanity to partner with God in perfecting it, Tikkun Olam. Contrast with ancient contexts. In the ancient Near East, creation myths often depicted gods as capricious, with humans as mere servants. Genesis's portrayal of a single, purposeful God who creates humans in his image, Salam Elohim, Genesis 1:26-27, elevates humanity's role and God's character. This theological innovation distinguishes Israel's faith, making Genesis foundational to the Torah's monotheism. Theological legacy. The theme of God as creator reverberates throughout Genesis, as seen in God's control over nature, for example, the flood, Genesis 6:9, and history, for example, Joseph's rise in Egypt, Genesis 45:5-8. It establishes God's right to command humanity, underpinning the Torah's laws, for example, Leviticus, and narratives, for example, Exodus. In Jewish thought, this theme inspires awe and responsibility, encouraging stewardship of creation. Modern Jewish environmental ethics, drawing on Genesis, emphasize caring for the earth as a divine mandate. 2. The covenant relationship. The covenant relationship is a central theological theme in Genesis, defining the dynamic partnership between God and humanity, particularly through the chosen line of Abraham. This theme, introduced with Noah and fully developed with Abraham, establishes the framework for Israel's identity and mission, making Genesis the theological foundation for the Torah's covenantal narrative. Noahide covenant, Genesis 9:8-17. After the flood, God establishes a covenant with Noah and all creation, promising never again to destroy the earth with a flood. The rainbow serves as the sign of this universal covenant, symbolizing divine mercy and commitment. Theological significance. This covenant introduces the concept of a divine-human partnership, where God makes binding promises and expects human obedience, for example, Noah's righteousness, Genesis 6:9. It sets a precedent for later covenants, emphasizing God's faithfulness despite human sinfulness. Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 12:17. Genesis 12:1-3. God calls Abraham to leave Ur for Canaan, promising three things: land, Canaan, descendants, a great nation, and blessing, for all nations. This covenant marks the shift from universal to particular, with Abraham's family chosen to fulfill God's plan. Genesis 15. God formalizes the covenant through a ritual, passing through divided animals to signify his commitment. The promise of descendants is reiterated, despite Abraham's childlessness. Genesis 17. The covenant is expanded, with circumcision, Brit Milah, as its sign, binding Abraham's descendants to God. The promise of a son through Sarah, Isaac, reinforces the covenant's specificity. Theological implications. The Abrahamic covenant is the heart of Jewish identity, defining Israel as God's chosen people with a mission to bless the world. It introduces the Torah's recurring theme of covenantal reciprocity. God's promises require human faith and obedience. Development through patriarchs. The covenant is reaffirmed with Isaac, Genesis 26:25, and Jacob, Genesis 28:13-15, showing its continuity across generations. Each patriarch faces trials, for example, Abraham's Akedah, Genesis 22, Jacob's exile, Genesis 28, that test their faith, illustrating the covenant's demands. Joseph's story, Genesis 37:50, reflects covenantal providence, as God uses his trials to preserve the family, fulfilling the promise of descendants. His declaration, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good," Genesis 50:20, underscores divine faithfulness. Theological significance. The covenant establishes a relational theology, portraying God as both transcendent, making unilateral promises, and immanent, engaging with human struggles. This balance shapes the Torah's portrayal of God, from the Sinai covenant, Exodus 19:20, to the prophetic calls for covenant renewal. The promise of land ties Israel to Canaan, a central motif in the Torah, driving the narrative from Exodus to Joshua. The blessing to all nations gives Israel a universal mission, interpreted in Jewish thought as spreading ethical monotheism or modeling righteousness. Cultural and ritual impact. Circumcision, introduced in Genesis 17, remains a core Jewish practice, performed on the 8th day of a male infant's life. It symbolizes entry into the covenant community, connecting Jews to Abraham's legacy. The covenant informs Jewish liturgy, such as the Amidah prayer, which references God's promises to the patriarchs. Festivals like Passover recall the covenant's fulfillment, linking Genesis to the Exodus narrative. Rabbinic perspectives. Rabbinic tradition views the covenant as eternal, with Bereshit Rabbah emphasizing Abraham's faith as a model for Israel. The Talmud, for example, Shabbat 137b, discusses circumcision as a sign of God's everlasting commitment. Mystical texts like the Zohar see the covenant as a spiritual bond, uniting God and Israel in a cosmic partnership, reinforcing Genesis's theological depth. Broader influence. The covenant theme influences Christianity, for example, the New Covenant in Jesus, and Islam, for example, Abraham as a prophet, showing Genesis's universal impact. Its emphasis on divine-human partnership inspires ethical frameworks, such as contractual justice in Western law. 3. Humanity's dignity and fall. The theme of humanity's dignity and fall explores the dual nature of human existence, created in God's image with immense potential, yet prone to sin and its consequences. This theme, introduced in Genesis's early chapters, provides a theological anthropology that shapes the Torah's understanding of human purpose and the need for redemption. Humanity in God's image, Genesis 1:26-27. Humans are created in God's image, Tselem Elohim, granting them unique dignity, creativity, and moral responsibility. This status distinguishes humans from other creatures, giving them dominion over creation and a role as God's partners. Theological implications. The image of God suggests humans reflect divine qualities, such as rationality, relationality, and ethical discernment. It establishes human worth, influencing Jewish ethics like Pikuach Nefesh, saving a life, which prioritizes human life above most commandments. Rabbinic insights. Bereshit Rabbah interprets the image as humanity's capacity for holiness, urging Jews to emulate God's compassion and justice. The Talmud, for example, of 03:14, extends this dignity to all humans, emphasizing universal value. The Fall, Genesis 3. Adam and Eve's disobedience, eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, introduces sin, disrupting the harmony of Eden. The consequences include spiritual separation, exile from Eden, physical suffering, pain in childbirth, toil in work, and mortality. Theological significance. The fall explains the human condition. Free will enables rebellion, but sin brings brokenness. God's curse on the serpent and promise of redemption. Genesis 3:15. The Proto-Evangelium, introduce hope, foreshadowing the Torah's sacrificial and covenantal systems. Narrative development. The spread of sin is evident in Cain's murder of Abel, Genesis 4, the wickedness before the flood, Genesis 6, and the pride of Babel, Genesis 11. These stories universalize the fall, showing humanity's ongoing struggle with sin. Tension between dignity and sin. Genesis balances humanity's exalted status with its moral failures. The patriarchs, though covenant bearers, are flawed. Abraham lies, Genesis 12, Jacob deceives, Genesis 27, and Joseph's brothers betray, Genesis 37. Yet, God's grace sustains them, illustrating the tension between dignity and fall. This tension shapes the Torah's anthropology, portraying humans as capable of greatness, for example, keeping the law, but in need of divine guidance, for example, Sinai's commandments. Cultural and ethical impact. The image of God concept underpins Jewish ethics, such as the prohibition against murder, Genesis 9:6, and the value of charity, tzedakah. It also influences global human rights, which draw on the idea of universal dignity. The fall narrative informs Jewish teachings on repentance, Teshuvah, as seen in Yom Kippur's focus on overcoming sin. Genesis's portrayal of human potential and failure encourages self-reflection and moral growth. Broader influence. In Christianity, the fall shapes the doctrine of original sin, while in Islam, Adam's disobedience is a mistake followed by repentance. Genesis's anthropology resonates universally, addressing the paradox of human greatness and frailty. For family and divine legacy. The theme of family and divine legacy emphasizes the role of family as the vehicle for God's covenant and the transmission of divine promises across generations. This theme, prominent in the patriarchal narratives, underscores the importance of lineage, relationships, and communal identity in Genesis and the Torah. Family as covenant bearers. The patriarchal narratives, Genesis 12:50, focus on the families of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, through whom God's promises, land, descendants, blessing, are fulfilled. The covenant is passed from father to son, with each generation facing trials that test their faith. Examples: Abraham's faith in God's promise of a son, Genesis 15, Isaac's role as a bridge, Genesis 26, Jacob's transformation into Israel, Genesis 32, and Joseph's preservation of the family, Genesis 45, illustrate family as the locus of divine legacy. Family dynamics and struggles. Genesis portrays families as complex, with rivalries, for example, Cain and Abel, Genesis 4, Jacob and Esau, Genesis 27, favoritism, for example, Joseph, Genesis 37, and reconciliation, for example, Joseph and his brothers, Genesis 45. These dynamics humanize the covenant, showing God's work through imperfect relationships. Theological significance: the struggles reflect the reality of human sin, but God's providence ensures the covenant's continuity, as seen in Joseph's declaration that God turned evil into good, Genesis 50 hours 20 minutes. Genealogies and continuity. The Toledo, generations, sections, for example, Genesis 5, 11, 25, trace family lines, emphasizing the covenant's transmission. The genealogy from Shem to Abraham, Genesis 11:10-26, links the primeval and patriarchal sections, while Jacob's sons, Genesis 49, become the 12 tribes of Israel. Cultural role: genealogies reinforce Jewish identity, with tribal affiliations and naming practices rooted in Genesis. They also universalize the narrative, as Genesis 10's Table of Nations includes all humanity. Theological and cultural impact. The focus on family shapes Jewish values, such as communal responsibility, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Bezeh, all Israel is responsible for one another, and the importance of lineage. Practices like naming children after ancestors reflect Genesis's legacy theme. The patriarchal stories inform Jewish liturgy, such as the Avos section of the Amidah, which invokes Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as covenantal ancestors. Rabbinic perspectives. Rabbinic tradition views the patriarchs as spiritual archetypes, with their families modeling Jewish virtues. For example, Abraham's hospitality, Genesis 18, inspires Haknasat Orchim, welcoming guests, while Joseph's forgiveness, Genesis 45, teaches reconciliation. The Zohar sees the patriarchs as embodying divine attributes, for example, Abraham as chaste, loving kindness, linking family to cosmic theology. Broader influence. The family theme resonates universally, influencing narratives in Christianity, for example, Jesus as a descendant of Abraham, and Islam, for example, Abraham's family as prophetic ancestors. It also shapes cultural values, such as the emphasis on family in Western and Middle Eastern traditions. 5. Interconnection of themes. The 4 theological themes are interconnected, forming a cohesive theological vision that makes Genesis the cornerstone of the Torah. The theme of God as sovereign creator establishes divine authority, which underpins the covenant relationship, as God's promises reflect his power and faithfulness. Humanity's dignity and fall explain the need for the covenant, as human sinfulness requires divine redemption, fulfilled through Israel's election. Family and divine legacy provide the human context for the covenant, showing how God's plan unfolds through generations. Together, these themes create a narrative arc, from creation's goodness to sin's disruption, covenant's hope, and family's legacy, that shapes the Torah's theology. 6. Historical and cultural context. The theological themes of Genesis must be understood in their historical and cultural context, as they reflect Israel's unique monotheistic vision in a polytheistic world. The emphasis on God as creator countered ancient myths. The covenant distinguished Israel from other nations. The anthropology of dignity and fall offered a new view of humanity, and the family focus resonated with tribal cultures while elevating lineage to a divine purpose. The final form of Genesis, likely shaped during or after the Babylonian exile, used these themes to strengthen Jewish identity, making them foundational to the Torah's message. 7. Enduring legacy and relevance. The theological themes of Genesis have left a lasting legacy, influencing Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and global ethics. The concept of God as creator inspires awe and environmental responsibility. The covenant shapes religious and legal frameworks. The dignity and fall theme informs human rights and moral reflection, and the family legacy theme underscores communal values. In modern Judaism, these themes are studied, prayed, and lived, ensuring Genesis's ongoing role as the Torah's theological cornerstone. Thank you for watching Big Breaking News of America. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon for more news updates. Share our channel with your friends and family members, leave a like for more videos and express your thoughts under comment section.